Welcome to this webinar on working with perpetrators of violence against older women. My name is Heinrich Geldschläger. I'm a psychologist at Connexus Association in Barcelona, Spain, with 25 years now of experience in the field of gender-based violence and in the work with perpetrators. I'm happy to present this webinar recording together with my colleague Apolline Perel from the Age Platform Europe. This webinar recording is an adapted version of a live webinar that we held in September 2025, organized by the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence, as part of the EU project MARVO2, a multi-agency response to violence against older women. In that webinar, more than 30 professionals from many different countries participated, but it could not be recorded. So for this posterior recording, we had to substitute the group discussions and the work in small groups through breakout rooms, including on some case studies, with individual reflections and exercises. And this is also why my colleague Apolline Perel is not with us now, but will present the second session of this webinar. Before starting, we want to thank Sandra Jovanovic and Dura Mirza from WWP for their support in preparing and in running the original webinar. And we also, as another preliminary note, want to say that working with older perpetrators is quite a novel field where we have very little specific practice and research, as we will find out during this webinar. So more than a traditional training, the webinar really pretends to provide some inputs for discussion, for reflection, and for practice development. The objectives of the webinar are to understand the specific dynamics of gender-based violence against older women, identify how societal ageism and sexism, gender norms intersect in these cases, and recognize age-related factors that shape the perpetrator's behavior. And that will hopefully then help us develop some adapted intervention strategies for working with older perpetrators. The agenda for the whole webinar consists of the following 5 sessions. We will now start with the introductory session around violence against older women. Then Apolline will take you through the second session on age and the perpetration of violence. And then back to me with different types of perpetrators of violence against older women, focusing in the 4th session on older perpetrators of intimate partner violence. And then in the 5th and last sessions, we will look at possibilities of tailoring our interventions to this group of older perpetrators. So for this first session, the agenda is a short presentation of the training, but mainly an introduction to the MARVO2 project, and then some definitions of different types of violence, the prevalences of these types of violence that we know of in Europe and some specific countries, and then have a short reflection on your own on what you know about violence against older women in your specific country. So as an introduction to the MARVO2 project, its general objective is to improve the response to violence against older women through a coordinated multi-agency collaboration. It is based on previous projects, as the name indicates, on the Huseva project, which was directed mainly to health services, the Tisova project, and the first edition of MARVO. We started our work on this project in April 2023 and will finalize it at the end of this month, March 26. So the total project duration has been of 3 years, and it has been implemented in 7 different countries: in Austria, in Greece, in Bulgaria, in Italy, in France, Cyprus, and Spain. And the partner organizations who participated were mainly specialized in domestic violence and abuse or gender-based violence. But we also had 3 European networks on board, one around older people, which is the Age Platform Europe, where Apolline, our colleague, works, and 2 important networks on domestic violence and abuse. On the one hand, Women Against Violence Europe, a network of victim support organizations mainly, and the European Network for the Work with Perpetrators of Domestic Violence, WWP, which organizes this webinar. So this is the MARVO project consortium that has been very well coordinated by the Austrian Women's Shelter Network, AOF. Thank you very much to them, and thank you to all the partners for the really excellent collaboration throughout these 3 years. I will not mention all of the organizations that you can find here, but it has really been a pleasure to work together. The objectives of the MARVO 2 projects were to develop a specific risk assessment checklist to be used by frontline professionals. That was a result both of the previous MARVO project and of the needs assessment that we realized in the different implementation countries, that there really was a need to have specific additional risk assessment tools, since the traditional risk assessment instruments do not include specific risk factors relevant to older women. It was also to develop and deliver a comprehensive training program for professionals at the national or local level, and also replication trainings at the European level. And this webinar is part of these European replication trainings. To introduce, test, and then mainstream a protocol for coordinated multi-agency work and case management in cases of violence against older women, and then to create policy recommendations to improve the legal frameworks and the service provision both on the national levels and on the EU level. And then, of course, to disseminate and promote the projects and its results among the different stakeholders, so professionals, policymakers, and the general public, again, both at the national level of all the implementation partners and at the EU level. Here you can see some of the MARVO products that we delivered. There is a training manual for delivering trainings to professionals on addressing violence against older women. There is the risk factor checklist that we developed, a manual of operation, which includes hints on how to work with violence against older women at different stages. And there are the policy recommendations that we've mentioned, both on the national and on the EU level. And we also developed different materials for campaigns, videos, fact sheets. And there was campaigning on social media to visualize the violence against older women as an important issue and to raise awareness. All these materials are available at the MARVO website, marvo.eu, and there's a resource section where you can find all of these materials in English and in the country languages. These are some examples of the campaign materials, the fact sheet that we developed, and some social media campaigning on visualizing and raising awareness around the issue. So after this introduction to the MARVO project, we will go on with some basic definitions, starting with who are we talking about when we say older women. Within the MARVO 2 project, we have defined older women as women aged 60 or older, according to the definition of the World Health Organization. Although some countries, including us here in Spain, would have preferred a definition of women aged 65 or older. in accordance with retirement age and with the feeling of many older women themselves. This leads us to the fact that age is also a social construct, and you will hear more about that in the next session with Apolline. What is violence against older women? Mainly, we can distinguish between three types of violence against older women. There's elder abuse on the one hand, the widest definition. There's domestic violence and abuse, and within domestic violence and abuse, specifically intimate partner violence. The most widely used definition of elder abuse by Action on Elder Abuse and then adopted by the World Health Organization is elder abuse is a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring with any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. This is the broadest definition of the three, elder abuse. Domestic violence in Article 3 of the Istanbul Convention is defined as any act of physical, sexual, psychological, or economic violence that occurs within the family or domestic unit or between former or current spouses or partners, whether or not the perpetrator shares or has shared the same residence with the victim. So here we have intimate partner violence, but also children to parent violence and other forms of violence within the family or domestic unit. Finally, intimate partner violence, defined by the World Health Organization in their report on violence and health from 2002 as any behavior within an intimate relationship that causes physical, psychological, or sexual harm to those in the relationship. So graphically, we can somehow explain the relationship between these three types as three concentric circles, where elder abuse includes the other two forms of violence. Domestic violence then on a second level includes intimate partner violence, in this case against older women. If we look at the prevalence and the specificities of violence against older women, I would invite you to take a moment and reflect on what you know or imagine about the prevalence of violence against older women in your country specifically, maybe also on the EU level. To reflect on what the obstacles are for victims, survivors to seek help, and also on the challenges to address violence against older women, the identification, the protection, and the support of older women who face this type of violence. So please take a minute to reflect on this. So here are some data on the prevalence of elder abuse. These are data from almost 10 years ago from two different meta-analytical studies published by the World Health Organization. This is 12-month prevalence. And as you can see, there's two studies, one regarding elder abuse within community settings and another one on elder abuse in institutional settings. If we look at the different types of abuse older people suffer in community settings as reported by the older adults themselves, we can see that just over 1 in 7, almost 16%, have suffered any abuse in the year before these studies. The main type of abuse that they suffer is psychological abuse, but there's also considerable amount of financial abuse and neglect. There's a little less of sexual abuse and physical abuse suffered by older people in community settings. If we look at institutional settings, At first sight, it seems quite shocking that the prevalence rates, again, 1 year prevalence rates in institutional settings are higher, quite significantly higher than in the community settings. Even comparing the prevalence rates reported by older adults themselves or reported by staff, we find that according to staff, almost 2 out of 3 older adults suffer any kind of abuse in institutional settings. 1 out of 3 psychological abuse, according to both the older adults and the staff, but also high numbers of physical, financial abuse and neglect. So these are quite concerning prevalence rates, especially in the institutional settings, although our Marvel project centers more on the community settings. Now, if we look at gender-based violence against older women, the latest EU gender-based violence survey from 2024, based on interviews with more than 100,000 women in the 27 member states, shows us the following prevalence rates for older women. 1 out of 4 older women from 65 to 74 years reported having suffered psychological, physical, or sexual violence by an intimate partner. 1 out of 6 reported physical or sexual violence by a domestic partner, and 1 out of 8 physical or sexual violence by a non-partner. And as you can see, these lifetime prevalence rates since the age of 16 are slightly lower than for the whole group of women. And as you can also see, there's a clear limitation in this study by limiting the age of the women surveyed to 74, discriminating those women older than 74 years for whom we do not have prevalence data. And actually, as the Marvel 2 project, we have pointed that out to Eurostat, the Fundamental Rights Agency, and the European Institute of Gender Equality, who are responsible for these EU surveys, hoping that this will be changed in the next edition and that all women of all ages will be surveyed for the next edition of this survey. And this graph shows these different prevalence rates according to age in the gender-based violence survey in the EU, while women from 16 to 44 reports prevalence rates of almost 1 out of 3. In women aged 65 to 74, this prevalence rate drops to around 1 out of 4. We have some specific studies from different countries. This is a study on domestic abuse in later life by Hannah Bowes and colleagues who analyzed the crime survey data for England and Wales and show that the 1 year prevalence rates of partner abuse was around 2%, of other family abuse about 1%, so all domestic abuse combined was around 3%, and the lifetime prevalences since the age of 16 were around 12% for partner abuse, around 6% for other family abuse, and just under 50% for all domestic abuse combined. Of course, these numbers don't sum up because some women unfortunately suffer both partner and other family abuse. Here from Spain, we have some interesting data from the macro survey on violence against women, which is a representative survey with more than 10,000 interviews with women of all ages from 16 years on. And as you can see, we find lifetime prevalences for physical and sexual and or sexual abuse, psychological abuse and economic abuse that are actually slightly or quite a bit higher in older women, which makes sense because, of course, the accumulated abuse they can have suffered having lived a longer life makes the lifetime prevalence more probable. On the other hand, if we look at the 1-year prevalence rates, they are not that different. They are slightly lower for physical and sexual violence, just under 1%. They are almost identical regarding psychological violence, around 10%. And actually, they are higher and significantly higher for older women. 2.6% of older women in our definition, 65 years and older, report having suffered economical violence compared to 1.7% of younger women. But the more interesting data actually of this survey have to do with older women's access to support, reporting to the police, or their informal help seeking. And as you can see, the reports to the police or to the justice system are even a bit lower in women over 65 than in the younger women, or 65 and over than in the younger women. They access psychological report far less than the younger women. Only just over 13% of older victims access psychological support compared to 28% of younger women. And just over half of the older women who suffer gender-based violence tell anybody about it compared to over 80% of the younger women. And also we have quite concerning data about the chronification of violence against older women in Spain. 40% of the older women surveyed said they had experienced violence for 40 or more years, and another 27% for 20 to 30 years, which means that 2 out of 3 older women who suffered violence had done so for more than 20 years, and the average was 21 years. Interesting also the data that only around 6% of cases attended by the public victim support services here in Catalonia were women over 60 years. So there's a clear discrepancy between the prevalence rates, which are almost as high as in younger women, and the percentage that is really then supported by the relevant services. If we look at the most extreme cases of violence against older women, femicides, what we found in our research in the Marble project was that there is a concerning lack of official femicide data from many countries. Some countries do have official data. For example, in Spain, 13.4% of women killed by their partners or ex-partners in the last 10 years were age 61 or older. Similarly, in the UK, 1 in 8 women killed by men since 2009 were aged 70 and older. 262 of around 200,000 cases according to the femicide census. And older women, here defined as 65 plus, made up around 11% of intimate partner homicides. So these data from the UK and Spain seem to coincide more or less. From other Marvo partners, we have unofficial data from our partners in Austria. Around 1/3 of femicides between 2020 and 2023 were women 60 years or older. From Bulgaria, our colleagues at NAIA told us that 41 femicides against women 60 years or older between 2020 and 2025, so 37% of the total, 1/3 of these committed by partners or ex-partners. And from France, our colleagues at CITEL reported that 21% of the 102 women killed by their ex-partners were older women. From the EU, we know that in 2023, 569 women aged 60 or older were victims of intentional homicide. And this is without the data which is missing from some of the countries, including UK, Belgium, and Bulgaria. So concerning lack of official femicide data, that should really be overcome. This is the graph for these intentional homicide data, victims by family members or intimate partners. And as we can see here, quite constantly in the last 10 years in the EU, there's twice as many women killed by family members or intimate partners than men. So both in the needs assessments, roundtables, focus groups, and interviews that we ran as part of the Marvel project, and in the data that we've seen, for example, from Spain, we see that older survivors seem to seek help less. They access less to psychological support, to specialized support. They report less to the police, and they talk less about their experiences of violence. So what are the main obstacles to this help seeking, specifically in older survivors? One is the normalization of the abuse. For those who've experienced long-term abuse, it might have become normalized over decades, and there's also this aspect of learned helplessness, that after such a long time, it might be difficult to believe that change is possible at all. Similarly to younger survivors, the fear of retaliation or escalation, of course, is present in many older women, that disclosing the abuse will lead to increased violence, but additionally, it might lead to an abandonment by the abuser, who might be a caregiver to her, or there can be a fear of being placed in an institution if the violence is disclosed. Many older women carry immense shame or embarrassment about being a victim, especially after a long marriage, or if the abuser is a child. They may feel it's a personal failure, or that they will not be believed. Also, the loyalty and the idea of protecting the abuser, particularly when the abuser is an adult child or a frail spouse, they may feel a strong sense of loyalty, pity, or responsibility for the abuser's well-being, also fearing legal consequences for them. Many older women are financially, physically, or emotionally dependent on the abuser, and that makes disclosure feel almost impossible, as it threatens their basic needs of housing, food, care. There might even be a fear of poverty and homelessness, and of course it is difficult or nearly impossible for older women to access the labor market. Older women may also have a lack of awareness of their rights and options. They might not know what kind of help is available to them, or that what they are experiencing constitutes abuse in the eye of the law or the support services. Of course, if there are cognitive or physical impairments, these make it more difficult for older women to communicate their experiences or actively seek help. And as with younger women, abusers often isolate older victims from friends, family, and community, reducing their opportunities for someone else to notice or for the victim to reach out. And then violence against older women is often less recognized or invisible in public discourses, policy, and even within the support services. And that's why our campaign raised awareness about this invisibility and trying to change it. This invisibility of violence against older women is also one of the main barriers to the detection of violence against women. Another one is ageism and stereotyping. So professionals may assume older women are not victims of domestic violence, or that injuries are simply due to falls or age-related frailty. They may struggle to see older women as individuals with sexualities and relationships. There might be a lack of awareness and training, and that has come out in our needs assessment. Many professionals lack specific training in recognizing signs of domestic violence in older adults, particularly non-physical forms like financial or psychological abuse. And they may not know what questions to ask or how to interpret the responses. Also, there might be this confusion with elder abuse. Domestic violence in older adults is sometimes miscategorized simply as elder abuse, and then leads to different referral pathways, which might not connect victims with specialized domestic violence services. Of course, there's always time constraints in healthcare and other service settings. Limited time for comprehensive assessments, making it sometimes difficult to build the rapport needed and create a safe space for disclosure. Privacy concerns may play a role, especially if a caregiver or family member, potentially the abuser, is present. And then there's a lack of standardized screening tools. Age-appropriate screening protocols for domestic violence in older adults is not in place in many services. And generally there might be a reluctance to intervene or interfere, as they might feel, for professionals in what they might perceive as private family matters, or there might be a fear of straining the working relationship, for example, between a doctor and a patient. And also on behalf of the professionals, there might be this idea of learned helplessness, the belief that older women won't change, won't report, won't separate, and or that there are no adequate solutions or support offers available to them. If we look at the barriers to support for older women, some of them are quite similar and have to do with this point of learned helplessness, because it is unfortunately true that there is a lack of specific service offer for older survivors, especially regarding accommodation. Many standard domestic violence shelters are not equipped for the physical, medical, or mobility needs of older women, stairs, lack of accessible bathrooms, etc. They may also be perceived as suitable due to the presence of younger women with children, so specific housing offers are an issue clearly. The one-size-fits-all approach of services, which are often designed rather for younger victims and failing to address the unique concerns and needs of older women. Long-term abuse, concerns about pensions, care needs, desire to avoid institutionalization, etc. Digital exclusion, lack of digital skills or internet access on behalf of many older women creates a barrier to accessing online resources or communicating with services that ever more rely on digital platforms. There are geographical barriers, especially in rural areas where isolation is even more of an issue. Lack of transportation and mobility issues can really prevent older women from reaching available services even if they find out about them. And then, of course, there's financial barriers. Many of the older women, especially those who have been financially dependent, may lack the independent financial resources to leave or secure new housing, pay for legal assistance, etc. And finally, the language and cultural barriers for older women from minority ethnic backgrounds, or the lack of culturally sensitive services or language support might be an additional barrier. And last but not least, the lack of coordinated responses, the poor coordination between health, social care, and domestic violence and abuse services means that older victim survivors can easily fall through the cracks. And to wrap up this first session of the webinar, it is important to take into account the social context of violence against older women at the intersection of ageism and sexism in our patriarchal societies. So both age stereotypes and gender stereotypes are at play when we talk about violence against older women who are paternalized and infantilized as older persons and who are discriminated as women. There is a tendency of homogenization and reductionism as older people, and a re-victimization as women from a sexist discrimination, negative representations and or invisibility of older person on the one hand, and the representation within power relationships, submission and control of women by men. In older people, there's a tendency of asexualization, whereas women in general are hypersexualized and objectified, and older people are seen as passive, or their agency is eliminated, and women's agency is also being appropriated. So this social context of violence against women in the intersection of ageism and sexism is important to take into account when we talk about violence against older women, also when we talk about working with older perpetrators. And you will hear and discuss more about that in the next session with Apolline. Welcome back to the third session of our webinar on working with older perpetrators. In this session, we will have a look at different types of perpetrators of violence against older women. We'll have a look at the differences in risk factors, relationship, and abuse dynamics between these different groups or types of perpetrators, and what these differences imply for intervention with these different groups. But before that, I would invite you and us to have a more experiential access to the issue by watching a short video on intimate partner violence against an older woman. And of course, here's a trigger warning. This might be distressing for some of you due to the mainly verbal abuse that's going to be depicted and controlling behavior in this video. The video is called Eggshells, and I would invite you to watch it with some questions in mind for observation and reflection. One is how watching the video impacts you emotionally. Another is what the types of violence and abuse are in the video, what the relationship dynamics are represented, and whether these are specific for older women or not. Okay, so here goes the video now.
These are for you, sweetheart.
Oh, they're lovely.
I love you. What have you been doing all day?
I tidied up, I've not stopped. I've just sat.
Look at the lamp. Dust all over that. Get it sorted. What are you doing?
It's my sister.
You really going to answer that when we're having lunch?
I've not seen her in ages.
Go on then, let's spoil it. Go on. Answer it. Go on. Go on. You daft cow. Why have you bought all this expensive junk? I'll have to give you less money next time. Can't do anything right, can you? Yeah, Tom. Your mother's dressed like a clown. You should see it. It's classic, Liz. The only thing that's missing is a red nose. I'll start calling her Krusty from now on. Hello. I've messaged your dad. Told him we can't make his birthday. Can't be bothered with all your gang ignoring me.
Right.
It's just us. Get these cobwebs cleaned up. Wake up, you lazy pig. It looks ridiculous. Shut up. Think about it before you say anything. Why do you make me do these things? You're not going anywhere. You're staying here. You're staying here. You're staying here.
That was me, stuck in a cycle of abuse day after day, walking on eggshells in my own home. I reached out, I got the support I needed to leave him, and you can too.
So we've seen this representation of the ongoing psychological abuse, humiliation, economic abuse, and isolation from family and friends in this video. And we will now go on with the next. So as we've seen in the introductory session, we can distinguish mainly three types of perpetrators of abuse and violence against older women. The elder abuse perpetrator, the domestic violence and abuse perpetrator, and the intimate partner violence perpetrator. Within elder abuse, we could subsume all the different possible persons who could perpetrate abuse or violence against an older woman, from the partner, son or daughter, grandson, other family members, friends, or even professionals. Within domestic violence and abuse, the perpetrators could be either the partner or other family members, possibly also friends who are living in the same house with the older woman, but that would be more an exceptional situation. And within intimate partner violence, of course, it is the partner or ex-partner who perpetrates the violence or abuse against the older woman. So let's start thinking about the differences between these three different groups of possible perpetrators of violence against older women. And let's think about what the differential characteristics and risk factors are for each group: a partner, ex-partner, other family members, or professional or informal carers. What would be the typical relationship dynamics and abuse dynamics in these relationships? And what are the implications and possibly challenges for intervention with these different types of perpetrators, and also for victim support? So have a moment to think about these questions. Now, if we have a look at the different characteristics and risk factors for these different types or categories of perpetrators of violence against older women, it is important to remember that these are risk factors and characteristics, not deterministic causes. As we know, violence is a complex phenomenon and often a result of a combination of factors at the individual relationship, community, and societal levels. What research tells us about intimate partner violence perpetrator characteristics against older women, that of course they are usually male partners or ex-partners, and they may have a long-standing history of intimate partner violence, as we've seen in some of the data and statistics from Spain, for example. So 20, 30, 40 years of chronic violence and abuse, but it can also be of onset in later life due to stress or difficulties in adapting to retirement, to illness or dependency. Risk factors, typical risk factors for intimate partner violence at older age are, similarly to younger age, traditional gender norms, a sense of entitlement, needs for power and control, substance abuse or mental health issues are risk factors, poor conflict resolution skills, and then carer stress, social isolation, dependency, and or frustration to illnesses or health decline, and or a change in roles and routines due to retirement. And we'll get back to that with more detail in the next session. For domestic violence by other family members, mainly children, these are commonly adult sons, sometimes daughters, who live with the older women, and risk factors also have to do with a sense of entitlement, a lack of empathy or compassion for the older woman, the mother usually, situations of unemployment, financial dependency, sometimes due to substance abuse issues or mental health issues, intergenerational family conflict, and in some cases also caregiver stress in situations of cohabitation due to economic issues. If we look at professionals, professional or informal carers, usually these are paid. The professional carers, of course, informal carers might be friends or neighbors. And research tells us that caregiver stress, poor training, and poor coping skills, low pay, burnout, mental health issues, sometimes also substance abuse issues, and an own history of violence are risk factors on the personal level, but on the institutional level, a lack of oversight and supervision are also important to take into account here. If we look at the typical relationship and abuse dynamics in intimate partner violence in older couples, these are often rooted, of course, in coercive control and patriarchal gender roles, which includes many types of abuse, as we've seen in the video also. Again, we can have situations of chronic intimate partner violence or onset linked to the changes in age that we've mentioned, shifts in role, changes in health, and as we've seen, women may stay due to the fear of abandonment, shame, or dependency, and isolation is quite common in these cases. In domestic abuse, apart from intimate partner violence by other family members, usually children, this often involves financial exploitation, financial abuse, but also psychological abuse and neglect to a lesser degree, but also possible physical violence. It is often framed as family conflict or carer stress, and the abuse can include, apart from the financial exploitation, manipulation, threats, or neglect. It might co-occur with caregiver stress or unresolved family conflict, and the dependency, sometimes codependency, and living arrangements play a big role usually, especially with the children to parents, children to mother violence in this case. With regard to the relationship and abuse dynamics by professional or informal carers, it might be opportunistic or systematic exploitation, usually financial. It can be neglect, psychological abuse, or physical maltreatment. Apart from the financial exploitation, it might be hidden due to the dependency of the victims, their cognitive impairment, or fear of losing care. The institutional abuse might be facilitated by organizational structures, it might be unreported or due to a lack of oversight, as we've mentioned before. The main implications and some challenges for the intervention with perpetrators and the victim support for these different types of perpetrators are the following. For intimate partner violence perpetrators, of course, it requires an understanding of these life course dynamics of intimate partner violence, the possible chronic patterns versus late onset violence that we've already mentioned. A key challenge is that older women very often feel tied to the relationship due to fear of abandonment or guilt for a possible abandonment, especially if the partner is in need of care. Interventions and safety planning must adapt to the physical and cognitive health of both the perpetrator and the survivor. Risk assessment, we've talked about that, needs to be adapted to capture the specific factors of intimate partner violence and patterns in old age. Isolation, health, and gender beliefs need to be addressed on both sides. and the position and the support of children with regards to the violence on behalf of the father is often key for the intervention, both with the survivor, especially with the survivor, um, and also with the perpetrator. So if children can be involved to really support their mothers, that's usually a key factor for successful support with the older women. With domestic violence by other family members, this is for similar reasons difficult to address with the older women due to still stronger gender beliefs and roles that for mothers are even stronger than for women as partners. These beliefs around family really create feelings of shame and guilt in mothers that are especially difficult to overcome. And the financial codependence is another frequent factor to be taken into account. The risk of victim self-blame and refusal to report results from these feelings of shame and possible feelings of having failed as a mother. And the intervention needs to balance the support for the victim with the safe management of the perpetrator, who sometimes is also dependent in cases of children with substance abuse, mental health, or other issues. And of course, multi-agency coordination is essential in these cases. If the perpetrators are professional or informal carers, the risk of isolation for the victim is an important factor if the carer is removed. So safeguarding must include alternative care solutions here. The need for robust safeguarding and care standards and accountability in the caring institutions, and this includes workforce training, oversight, and inspections. Then victims, of course, may fear retaliation and loss of care if they report. Okay, so to finalize this third session on the different types of perpetrators of violence against older women, we'll have a closer look at one of the few studies that we found on the issue. It is a study again by Hannah Bose and her team on the characteristics and risk factors of professional responses to perpetrators of violence against older women. It is a mixed method study which included evidence review, the analysis of almost 70 safeguarding case files, and interviews with 66 involved professionals. And one of the main results actually of this study is that there is quite a limited knowledge of perpetrators. In their evidence review, they found that only 2 out of the 75 papers that they looked at included information on the perpetrator, so their backgrounds, the information on their backgrounds, health, drug use, criminal history, employment is very scarce, and only 2 of these studies included such information. With regards to the perpetrator profiles, they are typically male, mostly adult sons, followed by partners. The fewer female perpetrators were mainly daughters and a smaller proportion female partners. The common risk factors in both the domestic violence and intimate partner violence perpetrators were poor mental health and drug or alcohol abuse, particularly in sons or daughters. A criminal history is also observed in children, but less so in intimate partner violence. physical and mental health issues in victims and or perpetrators are also common risk factors. Dependency and generational attitudes, norms, beliefs, and negative attitudes towards older people, ageism, are other risk factors that were found in this study. We've talked about the invisibility of abuse as an important barrier to identification and provision of support. This was also found in the study. The abuse of older adults is often invisible to services and not often identified as domestic abuse. And this is understood due to generational norms and a lack of awareness by professionals and the community in general. And that fact that oftentimes policies and tools do not adequately consider older age, don't have a life cycle perspective. Other results of the studies include the stereotypes that affect identification of violence and abuse against older women. The stereotype, the idea of perpetrators as young male partners seems to be influencing the understanding of domestic abuse, which leads that abuse by other family members, sons and daughters, is easily overlooked. And also older perpetrators are often considered vulnerable and assumed incapable of being abusive, which leads to the victims not always believed or to assumptions of lower risk if the perpetrator is an older man. We've also mentioned the difficulty in risk assessment. Very few instances of risk assessment were found in the case files, and the applicability of existing domestic abuse risk assessments for older adults is not clear. Specific risk factors might not be included, particularly when the perpetrator is a child, a son or a daughter, and not the partner. And finally, Bowles and colleagues observed gaps in perpetrator interventions. The very few specialized perpetrator programs that are available are primarily designed for younger adult men who abuse their partners and seem less relevant for older perpetrators or for adult children who abuse their parents. And we will have a closer look at that in the next sessions, and actually our surveys, the surveys that WWP did within membership on working with older perpetrators confirm these results. In this fifth and final session of our webinar on working with older perpetrators, we will have a look at how we can tailor our interventions to the specific group, both in the intake and assessment phase, and we will specifically look at additional risk assessment through the Marbo risk factor checklist. We will look at tailoring interventions at the stage of individual or group work, and with regards to the coordination with victim support services and other services in the framework of a multi-agency collaboration. But before we go into these different options of tailoring the interventions, we'll look at the little existing research on interventions with older perpetrators, and we will have a look at some practice examples from the WWP membership based on two different surveys that were run by WWP within the Marvo and the Marvo 2 projects. There is little empirical research on the work with older perpetrators. In a general meta-analysis by Jewell and Wormuth, they already around 15 years ago, the authors found that older perpetrators were 16% more likely to complete treatment than younger perpetrators, that they were significantly more likely than younger perpetrators to complete either cognitive behavioral therapy or unspecified programs in comparison to programs based on the Duluth model. And they were more likely to complete short programs, 16 weeks or under, than longer programs. And we'll see later that this last finding is in contrast to what some of the practitioners surveyed among the WLP members told us. The study that we've already mentioned by Hawksworth makes some recommendations for intervention based on his qualitative interviews with a group of perpetrators on probation. He recommends to challenge and alter the invisible gender-related beliefs, so the expectations and attitudes, sense of entitlement, misogynistic attitudes, as the main contributor to IPV-related risk in later life, which is not very different to what we do with younger perpetrators, but possibly older perpetrators, even more than the younger ones, lack awareness of these gender-related beliefs. And he found that this typically is not addressed in prior interventions. To increase help-seeking and engagement, he recommends addressing concrete, tangible needs during crisis and life transitions, areas such as accommodation, mental health, alcohol use, and even financial problems. He recommends that interventions be responsive to anticipated circumstances, the evolving needs, and anticipated areas of change in these life transitions in later life. For example, retirement, health decline, changes in family structure across the life stages help to enhance the man's adaptation and by that reduce IPV risk. Also, he recommends to interrupt other limiting continuities that make adaptation to later life changes difficult. Again, the gendered beliefs, past experiences, and other individual factors, including mental health or substance use, should be addressed. And then within limits, he recommends to validate or at least listen to non-judgmentally, listen to the perpetrators' narratives and accounts. They may have insights into how different issues on their individual level contribute to their behavior, even if there's a lack of gender awareness that then, of course, through our interventions and our conversations with them, we should support and create accountability and motivation to change. On the other hand, as we've mentioned before, WLP has run 2 surveys among their membership in the first Marbo project in 2021. There were a few answers on behalf of the different perpetrator programs that responded. Actually, only one, which is the Women to Women Counseling Center for Men and Boys in Albania, had a specific group intervention, although it was not so much directed at perpetrators of gender-based violence or perpetrators of intimate partner violence, but rather to men who had been violent in the context of a senior care home in cooperation with which this specialized group was run. Colleagues from the Men's Development Network in Ireland reported that they adapted their program case by case, including offering mediation and couple-focused dialogue in the cases that the older couples decided to spend the rest of the years together rather than assuming separation. In the UK, colleagues from the Muslim Women's Center reported that a longer-term engagement is needed for older couples, recommending no fixed time limit. Sometimes they say 5 to 10 years to achieve change, because the level of change required by both the victim and the perpetrator is overwhelming, and most services aren't set up for that. And as we said before, this seems to contrast with the results of the meta-analysis, where older perpetrators seem to benefit more from shorter rather than longer programs. Other responses to the survey included the Society for Nonviolent Communication in Slovenia, where colleagues emphasized leveraging local networks and training community elders and healthcare providers to recognize and refer older abusers, and they highlight the need also for geriatrics informed referrals and collaboration with addiction services, due to the high prevalence also of substance use in this specific group. Colleagues from the USOR Family Assistance in Croatia reported that their staff note a high rate of alcohol-related cognitive impairment and dementia among the older offenders, and also recommended involving psychiatric services, and they recommended enlisting the perpetrators' adult children, who often are caregivers, in the intervention, since the family members can strongly influence older abusers' behavior. We've talked about that before. This seems to be a very effective strategy in many cases to engage the adult children, both to support their mother, but also to hold the father accountable and support him, influence him to change his behavior. Colleagues from Sweden observed that there were many referrals from elder care facilities, and that most older couples cohabit and want to stay together. This is similar to what colleagues from Ireland reported, complicating the separation-based interventions, so that the colleagues in Sweden adjust standard content and offering housing assistance when needed. The second survey that WWT ran among their membership as part of this second edition of the MARVO project was done online in October and November 2023 to again find out about specific approaches of working with older perpetrators. 20 member organizations answered from 18 different countries, and only one organization indicated that they had specific procedures for perpetrators whose victims are older women, referring to a program for children to parent violence, without providing much further detail. So we're not talking about violence in intimate relationships. And the University of Bristol mentioned the PhD research by Hawksworth that we've made reference to several times during this training. None of the different programs and members that responded used a specific risk assessment tool, and we will have a look at the MARVO 2 risk factor checklist that we developed as part of this project in a while. Before we look at some suggestions for adapting our interventions to the specific needs of older men, a short overview or review of the situation in the better intervention programs in the US regarding older perpetrators. There are no distinct programs for older perpetrators in the US as well. The lack of age-specific curricula means that adjustments are informal, similar to what we've seen in the membership of WWP. So some irrelevant content like fatherhood might be speeded through. A review emphasizes that courts and law enforcement lack specific mechanism for older abusers, especially in assessing dangerousness. Again, the need for specific risk assessment is highlighted because older perpetrators often have different risk profiles, so a higher suicide risk. Experts recommend age-adjusted risk screening and supervision. For example, some elder abuse advocates note that older intimate homicide offenders are more likely to express suicidality, less likely to be estranged, and less likely to have known histories of partner violence. So standard lethality questionnaires should be modified by age. Some jurisdictions incorporate geriatric assessments, and that was a suggestion also made by some of the WFP members, into the offender intake to adapt treatment plans, and justice guidelines suggest longer supervision and cooperation with healthcare providers for older offenders, reflecting that change may take more time. Again, this is a suggestion that we've also heard from WWP members. So if we look at how we can tailor the interventions in intake and assessment, these are some suggestions from the literature, from the suggestions from membership. So engaging community resources is one option to increase referrals, partner with local clinics, faith leaders, and family networks to reinforce messages and encourage help seeking and referrals. Screening for cognitive decline, dementia, and mental health, and to involve geriatric specialists as needed in this process. The risk assessment should be adapted, complemented with specific risk factors, including the higher murder-suicide risk, and we will have a look at the MARVO 2 checklist as a proposal to do this right after this. Long-term alcohol drug problems are common in older offenders, and combining perpetrator interventions with addiction treatment or referrals is often important. We have to increase the help seeking and engagement by addressing concrete, tangible needs during crisis, accommodation, mental health, alcohol use, again, financial problems. We should address the intersection of age, power, gender, and violence, and explore man's adaptation to changes in later life and their impact on the sense of power, their male identity, and their use of violence, and explore the sense of purpose in life and its sources, so the sense of integrity versus despair, according to Erik Erikson's dilemma or development task in this stage of maturity. So, as we've said before, the MARVO 2 risk factor checklist was developed to fill this gap of lacking specific risk assessment instruments for older age. We have to say from the beginning that the MARVO risk factor checklist is not a validated, empirically validated risk assessment instrument. It is designed as an additional checklist to be used in combination with the usual risk assessment instruments that you use in your contexts. It was developed based on risk factors that had been identified in the previous EU projects TSOVA and TUSEVA, also on a review and systematization of existing risk assessment tools for violence against older women and older people in general, including the Elder Abuse Suspicion Index, EASI, and the Risk on Elder Abuse and Mistreatment instrument, REAMI. It's also based on the needs assessment, focus groups, and roundtables that we did as part of this Marvel projects with more than 300 professionals in the different implementation countries, gathering some input on existing practices and tools. And again, there we found that professionals told us that there are no specific risk assessment instruments available in the different countries. After a first proposal, an external expert reviewed the checklist favorably, and it then underwent testing with more than 400 frontline professionals during the Marvo training implementation, and feedback from the professionals who were trained and during their training used the risk factor checklist then led to improvements in this final version of the checklist. The use that we suggest is, as we said, to provide guidance for frontline professionals who already use a risk assessment tool, and to additionally use this risk factor checklist as a complementary tool rather than a standalone instrument. It is intended for professionals in different sectors, including healthcare, social services, police, judiciary, helplines, victim support, and perpetrator programs. And the target group is women aged 60 years or older who are victims of violence from perpetrators with whom they are familiar, intimate partners or family members. And it should not be used, of course, with older women victim survivors with neurological deficits or diagnosed with dementia, due to the need for specialized expertise in such cases. So you should collaborate with geriatric experts in these cases then. We'll give you a short overview of the different risk factors in the checklist. There are 10 risk factors to be concerned with the victim survivor, with different areas to explore, and 3 risk factors that are related to the perpetrator. For the victim survivor, the first area to explore are psychological or mental health issues, mainly the age-related ones, so psychiatric treatment, medications, changes in sleep, appetite, concentration, memory, problems or difficulties communicating are some of the areas to explore. This is not an exhaustive list, so there are more areas, of course, in each factor that can be explored. These are some examples. The second one would be functional dependency or disability, so poor mobility, physical impairments, the need for special medical equipment like a wheelchair or a walker or other medical products, changes in vision or hearing that can increase the risk of the older woman. Medical issues like illnesses, lack of medical treatment, or limited access to medical examination or treatment. The carer who might be the perpetrator not reporting serious symptoms or changes in her condition. And within the environment, a tense atmosphere in the home or damaged objects that can be observed in the victim's home or room are factors that have to be taken into account as part of the checklist. Financial dependency, of course, the lack of adequate income or finances is one risk factor, and financial abuse is another one. If the victim does not have access or is not able to manage her finances, pension, other sources of income, or their property rights, that is an area of risk to be explored. The disappearance of valuable items from the home, like jewelry and other valuable objects. Unpaid bills might be an indicator of financial abuse. And then with regards to the factor of lack of social or formal support for the victim, if there is no or low involvement in social or other services, that might be an indicator. If she does not have access to a phone or to electronic devices, or if this access is controlled by the perpetrator, the erosion of bonds between the generations in the family, if she's not close to her children or siblings, possibly due to intense of isolation on part of the perpetrator. If the family, especially her children, do not identify or minimize or justify the abuse, or do not support the older women in related needs, and or if the family is allied with the perpetrator, of course, that increases the risk for the older woman. Then changes in relationships might be an area to explore here. Sudden appearance of distant relatives that she vaguely knows, who wants to take care of her, live in her home, or of a new friend with romantic interest, sometimes happening after the death of the spouse or partner, is an indicator of a possible risk. Inappropriate or inconvenient households or living arrangements. Of course, the shared housing with the perpetrators or other family members with no privacy and safety, and inappropriate housing conditions, especially if there are special needs regarding accessibility, etc., are another risk factor. And then, as with younger women, adherence to traditional social gender norms, there might be exacerbated in older women if the woman does not recognize or identify the violent behavior as such, or minimizes the violence or justifies it as normal, or if the victim or survivor is unaware of the situation because it's been going on for such a long time, as we've seen, sometimes decades, or if the victim survivor is unwilling or feeling unable to change her situation. With regard to the perpetrator, there are 3 risk factors to be explored: the difficulties and stress adjusting to age-related changes. So stress and or frustration to a new role, for example, as a caregiver, inadequate caring might be adequate, there might be scaring skills, but maybe not caring and or coping skills, although we've seen that this is not the most frequent constellation that the perpetrator is taking on this caregiver role. Another area is distress related with dependence, illness, or cognitive impairment, or with related to retirement, the loss of the social role, prestige, occupation, and income. The possible feelings of demasculation and loss of a sense of purpose that we've discussed before. Being at home full time can increase the risk, and loss of the driving license also is one of these aspects of losing power. An ongoing history of perpetrating domestic violence, so chronification of the abuse and the previous criminal charges and convictions are, of course, a factor to take into account. And as with the victim survivor, the lack of social and formal support for the perpetrator is also a factor that has to be explored. So the social network, family, friends, and also the service involvement, social services, home care, regular checkups and health services, or any other kind of senior care services are important here. This is what the checklist looks like, as all the materials that were produced under the Marvel projects. You can find them in on the Marvel website, the resource section of the website. So it's marvel.eu. So there's the risk factors, the areas to explore, and then if this factor has been observed or not, or if there's no information available, or if it has not been assessed. And then we suggest that we distinguish between the risk factors and indicators that you as a professional have observed, that the older woman or the older perpetrator has reported, and that has been reported by another person, another professional service, and then annotate also by whom. And then the final row offers the possibility to comment on whether there's an increase in the frequency and or the severity of the different risk factors observed. Now, this is optional, but as we know, if there is an increase in the risk factor, or especially if it's in several risk factors, then we might be aware of the possible risk that the victim runs more immediately. As for the application of the Marvel risk factor checklist, through your professional judgment and ideally in the team, we suggest that you first use your usual risk assessment tool, and then additionally look at the risk factors identified in the risk factor checklist, and then integrate both the result of your usual tool and the additional factors identifies, and then according to the level of risk assessed, the management should be planned and delivered. This might include referrals to multi-agency risk management or monitoring systems like the MARAC or the Marvo to case management tool that you can also find on the website. It can include, of course, protection measures and or safety planning for the victim survivor and the treatment planning for the perpetrator. Now, if you want individually, we can't do this here in the groups as we did in the online webinar, but if you want to take your time to do this risk assessment exercise, you are more than welcome to. You should apply your usual risk assessment tool to a case of intimate partner violence in an older couple. If you do not have a risk assessment tool that you regularly use, you can use the Save Lives Dash risk checklist that you can find on the internet. And then in a second step, apply the Marvo 2 risk factor checklist to the same case. And after that, we suggest you answer these two questions for yourselves. Do the additional risk factors change the assessment of the risk? Which ones and in what way? And does the Marvo risk factor checklist seem helpful as a complementary tool? I can tell you that in the live webinar, most people said that the assessment changed the Marvo, including the Marvo risk factor checklist did change the overall risk assessment after using the two tools. If we now go to the group and individual work phase, tailoring our interventions might involve more flexibility in the program length and intensity. And as we've seen before, there have been contradictory recommendations. On the one hand, practitioners advise no strict time limit on achieving progress, because it might take longer than with younger perpetrators, might take years. On the other, older men may fare better in shorter intensive programs, as the meta-analytical results seem to suggest. Individual work might allow better adaptation to possible cognitive decline. The group, on the other hand, can function as a social support. Of course, we have to be aware of and address a possible minority status of older men. So there could be a group of several older men that would be the ideal constellation, probably. And the group can also be a source of purpose, usefulness to some of the men. With regards to the materials and activities, they might need simplification, slower pacing, and possibly accommodations, especially for hearing or vision impaired participants. And some of the research suggests to focus on practical skills, communication, empathy, and adaptation to the older life stages. And the meta-analytical results again suggest that cognitive behavioral techniques might be particularly helpful with this group. As with younger perpetrators, gender-related beliefs, masculinity should be addressed, and expectations and attitudes both towards women, a sense of entitlement, misogyny, and towards themselves, like limited help-seeking and adaptation to changes in later life, should be addressed as main contributors to intimate partner violence related risk in these later life stages. And again, this includes addressing the life transitions that older men undergo. Interventions should address and possibly anticipate these changes related to retirement, health, decline, changes in family structures, possible caregiver roles, and how they are experienced from a gender and power perspective. Issue of demasculation to enhance adaptation and reduce risk. And as we've said before, this could support the generation of purpose in later life and avoid a sense of despair. Cohabitation has to be addressed, to plan for cases where the couple stays together, look at safety measures with the perpetrators if separation is not possible, or if the couple decides to stay together despite the situation of violence. The social isolation and the support network is an important additional aspect to be addressed. Programs can leverage community bonds and try to involve local figures, mayors, pastors, doctors, whom seniors trust, and also engage the adult children or other relatives as support, as we've said, both for the victim survivor and for the perpetrator. And a specific exercise that we've found helpful in some individual cases, not only with older men, but also with younger men, is the lifeline exercise. The objective here is to help men reflect on their relationship with violence throughout their lives and understand the use, the purpose, the intentionality of the use of violence, which is, as we've seen before, often related to gendered expectations and attitudes, both towards women and towards themselves. And this can be part of a wider biographical work on men's relationship with violence, on exploring with them how they have been recruited into or learned about using violence, on when and how their use of violence started and changed, why and what for, and also when they have been victims of violence and how they have felt and coped then, and that can, of course, help to increase compassion and understanding for the victims and motivation for change. The exercise is to be used when there is already a good level of responsibility for the use of violence and motivation for change. So it's rather in the second half, third of the treatment, and we usually use it as an individual exercise that we sometimes propose as a homework between session, and then share and discuss it in the group. So the instructions for this exercise is to have a big sheet of paper, A3 format, and draw a timeline on the bottom of the sheet, or horizontal axis, from birth to the current age plus 5 years. So we go a little bit into the future to have a prospect and their hopes and aspirations for the future also included. And then a vertical line on the left from 0, unhappy, frustrated, unsatisfied, to 10, happy, satisfied, fulfilled. And it's also used then from 0 violence to 10, the highest use of violence that they've ever had in their lives. On the timeline then, we ask the men to mark the most significant events of their lives and their relationships, and to then join the dots and draw a line indicating their level of happiness at every point, at every significant event from 0 to 10. And after that, draw another line indicating the level, frequency, and severity of violence that they used against their partner or ex-partner. And then to have a look at the drawing and reflect on the relationships between the life events, the feelings about the life events, and the use of violence. And to then explore and discuss on how they understand, how they explain the changes in their use of violence. And we haven't had a chance in this webinar recording to look at the case studies, but this is how the lifeline exercise might have looked like with one of the case studies that we used. The blue line is the one of the happiness, and the purple line is the use of violence in the case of Arthur. And in this second example of a timeline from the case study of Andrew, we zoom in to the old age. And as you can see, these graphs can help the men understand how their use of violence might be intended to compensate feelings of demasculation, inadequacy, loss of power, and help them understand what they use the violence for. And finally, a few recommendations for tailoring interventions with regards to the coordination and the victim support. We should coordinate multi-service supports and link offenders, if needed, to geriatric mental health or substance abuse services. Victim safety protocols should consider older couples' contexts, because older women victims or survivors are often physically frailer. Safety planning must be more proactive and take this vulnerability into account. Older victims' autonomy should be valued while protecting them, including whether the perpetrator should have separate accommodation during the intervention. Sometimes we observe a tendency to place the women victim survivors in care homes when they really don't need that, when they still have sufficient autonomy to live on their own. Victim support should take into account that older abusers and victims often remain together, and safety planning must then account for the possible dependence of the victim on the perpetrator for care or finances. And programs should liaise with elder services, protective services, caregiver support, and ensure victims get the elder-specific support they need, simultaneously with the intervention with the perpetrator. And generally, to train staff of both perpetrator programs and victim support services on aging is highly recommended in all cases. And with this, we come to the end of our webinar, and we'd like to end it on a positive note with this interesting commercial on purpose in later life and on the possibility of change in later life. So here it goes. As we have seen, change is possible in older life, of course, and especially if there's purpose. Thank you very much for your attention and for watching. Bye-bye.